where does the Stanton Photo-match work fit into all this stuff?
The Stanton photo matches are one part of a large effort to reconstruct the environmental history of the Grand Canyon River corridor. And to me, that work is fundamental. It's a fundamental part of trying to decide and figure how to manage Glen Canyon Dam today. It's important for us to understand that at no time in Grand Canyon's history has a river ever looked the same and was static from one day to the next, or from 1 month to the next, or from one day to the next, or from 1 year to the next. And so things like the Stanton rephotography and repeating the photographs of all of these wonderful people who have come on this trip give us an opportunity to understand what the short-term variation in the old days used to be of sand storage along the riverbanks, of the characteristics of vegetation. And once we begin to piece together what that history is, we get a sense of what the dynamic nature is of the processes of this river in the absence of Glen Canyon Dam. And we need to know that information if we're going to understand what a healthy natural ecosystem really is in Grand Canyon. I think those results then are coupled with the day-to-day detailed process studies being undertaken by other scientists that involve sort of the physics and dynamics of river flow and sediment transport and interaction with fish and vegetation. The biological and chemical and physical laws that govern things like sediment transport don't change whether they operate in 1994 or 1954. I mean, we had gravity then and we have gravity now. But we need to calibrate those process studies against the interpretations of the past, so we have some sense about, if you put lots more sediment in this river system, well, how did it work, and how variable were the how variable, for instance, were the sizes of sandbars in the past. We think we have a picture, but without reconstructing history, we don't have any idea whether we might be right or wrong. So that's one whole part of why do all this. I think the other reason is from a practical management standpoint. We need to not only discuss changes in Glen Canyon Dam operations in relationship to how the dam was operated a few years ago, but we need to understand changes in Glen Canyon Dam's operation to restore a river system in relationship to the way this river was 40 years ago. And if we ignore the way the river was 40 years ago, then our perspective about what change is and what change is about really is very different. And therefore, I think that the Stanton rephotography and all the other rephotography reminds us of what this river corridor used to look like, and we need to lay that before the public, for the public then to decide, well, what kind of a river do we want? And so that's another critical reason why we want this.
without trying too hard to match it exactly, would you tell me again what you told me right when we first turned this camera on, just about this trip, just about what it means to get all these people together and stuff? I don't know if you can do that again or not. Just because I'm just thinking the sound is so much better now.
Right. Let me.
I don't know if you can do it.
Yeah,
or
I
not.
can't. What was I
Just what it means to bring all these people together.
Well, okay. I think that all of us who are down here in Grand Canyon today in 1994, who work associated with the Glen Canyon Environmental Studies program in its broadest concept, and that's the scientists, the guides, the volunteers, the cooks, the whole shebang, plus all the people in the outside world, the agency bureaucrats who run the different research groups, the leaders of scientific research programs, university faculty and students. We all care tremendously about how we're all involved. We all care about how the dam operates. We're all trying to get creditable science completed that might have some bearing on how the dam is managed. And as part of that, none of us can help but be exposed to sort of some of the political intricacies that are associated with taking a very important dam and a very important national park and trying to reconcile management. And we all also know that as part of that controversial and important effort, governmental agencies become crosswise with themselves. The environmental community becomes crosswise with the water development community. People fight amongst themselves as to who's going to control the water and the sediment. Grand Canyon's a wonderful place to have as your research area, or to be or to believe, or to sit in an office somewhere and believe that you actually control this. I control the river. I control the park. It's my park. It's my canyon. It's my river. You hear people say that. And we're all aware that these battles go on. It's part of human nature. And when you get down here, people get sucked up in the belief that, well, I'm the person who's going to save the Grand Canyon River corridor. And one of the things that I've been reminded in this trip by the old timers is just what how self-centered that view is, how naive that view is, how completely out of keeping with Grand Canyon is any sense of that. These people, as I sit and visit with them at night and on the boats, I'm reminded that that the value of Grand Canyon is far beyond any scientific enterprise. That Grand Canyon is a spiritual place. Grand Canyon is a place of awesome beauty that affects every human being in a different way. That Grand Canyon is a place of high adventure. How do you look downstream at this view we're looking at with the sun coming over the Kaibab Rim and delude yourself into thinking that some piece of science, which is a little tiny look at the natural world equates with what we look at. What we look at is indescribable. And these people who are with us on this trip, they could care less what agency or what little governmental group is controlling this river. I mean, because they know that no governmental agency controls it. These people know that the only thing that really matters is, in terms of environmental management, is what are the real world changes in what water and what sediment comes past the dam. They don't care which governmental bureau does the science or funds the research. All that they care about is what are the real on-the-ground changes. They want to know, well, what are the real changes that you've made down here? Because that's all that really matters to the river. And these people remind us that the fundamental experience of this place is a place where you can have high adventure and high personal, just really rich personal experiences. And we all need to be reminded of that. I only wish that this group of people on this river trip could not share their experiences with the people who attend the cooperating agencies meetings every 3 months, or the EIS team, or the National Park Service management, or the management of the Bureau of Reclamation offices in Flagstaff. These are the people you need to get down here. And we need to be in a setting where the bureaucracies don't prance around and try to take credit for this trip or this aspect of the trip or whatever. These are the people we need to learn from, and all of us need to be humble enough to realize that this place is fundamentally a place of high adventure and good experience.
Oh, that was great.
Okay, go ahead.
Do me a favor. You said could not share their experiences, and I think you meant could share their experiences.
That these people could share their experiences with the people who sit in agencies and offices and behind desks and think that they control Grand Canyon.
Say could share their experiences.
Could share their experiences.
Perfect. Maybe I can cut that in. I don't know.
Let me, I don't know what the question would be, but let me take a second to spell out what I think is a fundamental management decision to be made down here. I agree that Glen Canyon Dam is a fact, and that in our lifetimes, Glen Canyon will continue to exist as a dam, and it probably will continue to exist for hundreds of years. I think that the decision we have before us is a decision about whether to use as the standard of environmental management on this river the way the river corridor used to be, or the way the river corridor is. Steve Carruthers and Brian Brown, I think, very convincingly argue in their book, The Colorado River Through Grand Canyon, that the Colorado River is what they call a naturalized river, not a natural river. It's a naturalized river because it has natural processes, but those natural processes are not the processes that used to exist in Grand Canyon. The new processes are a clear, cold stream, biological productivity that is produced within the channel as opposed to brought in from upstream, a rich and abundant riparian ecological community that supports a far more diverse array of critters than ever existed in Grand Canyon before, and is now the home for some threatened and endangered species that are looking for homes from elsewhere. Smaller sandbars, but a usable number of sandbars, and a set of sandbars that also serve as substrate for tamarisk, marshes, and everything that depends on them. A river that fluctuates from year to year far less than it ever did. Now, my reading of Carruthers and Brown is that they argue that that is the value that we want to manage for the future of Grand Canyon. That we need to say, this is a wonderful, scenically beautiful set of rock and slopes, and thank God we can't screw that up except for the airshed. But that, in terms of the river channel and things that live just off the river channel, we ought to accept this and celebrate this place as a transformed trout stream that's just warm enough to support humpback chub at the mouth of the Little Colorado, maybe at a few more places. We ought to celebrate what a much more rich, diverse biological place this is, and that those are the objectives we want to manage. Essentially, we've got a little bit less of a few things from the past and a whole lot of new things we never had before. Bruce Babbitt, in his introduction to that book, essentially says the same thing. Babbitt says, those who would dream of returning the river to the ways of the past, who would do things as absurd, he doesn't use the word absurd, I say, those who would propose ideas like passing sediment around the dam are people who live in a dream world of changes that will never be made. And what we need to do is celebrate this river for the way it is. To me, that's a very solid intellectual and rational argument. But in 1994, I'm not willing to take that as gospel truth, despite my respect for each one of those individuals. You want to hold for a second? Yeah.
No, let's wrap this up. They're waiting on us, but
okay.
Screw them.
The contrasting view, which is one which I am much more sympathetic towards, is a view which says we need to remember what this canyon was like before the dams of the Colorado River system were built. That the Grand Canyon River, the river environment, was a fairly harsh place dominated by bedrock, talus, sand, and water. And that there are other places on the planet to celebrate biological productivity in arid environments, but this isn't one of them. If that comes as part of the deal, so be it. But to me, what we want to understand is how this river functioned before there were dams, and we want to restore just those processes. And so, to the degree that we can reintroduce big floods in this system, we ought to. To the degree that we can reintroduce sediment into this river system, we ought to. If there are biological communities that never used to be in Grand Canyon and that now have adapted to the steady flows that exist here now, and those communities would be jeopardized by reintroducing sediment and floods, then I would argue that sediment and floods are more important than protecting new communities by new ecological communities that are adjusted to much more steady flows of clear water. That we can't have it all in Grand Canyon. You cannot manage this river for trout, for riparian marshes along the water's edge, and manage this river for big open abundant sandbars. And what I want to argue for is I want to argue that the big open sandbars of Grand Canyon were a fundamental part of the landscape of Grand Canyon. They were a fundamental part of the landscape every bit as much as the Coconino Sandstone is, every bit as much as any other rock formation. When I sit around the fire with these folks on this trip, virtually everyone remarks that one of the things they loved about Grand Canyon was its big open sandbars. When I first started running rivers, I heard about Grand Canyon. Grand Canyon is a great place to be. It has big, gigantic sandbars. And yes, that's convenient and nice for camping, but it's just part of the landscape. And I think we've gotten ourselves into a difficult circle here. We've argued that sandbars, the function of sandbars, is just because it's a nice place to camp. And then you report that to somebody who lives in Nebraska, and you ask somebody who lives in Nebraska, well, how important or useful would it be to, what value should we manage Grand Canyon for? And you say to them, endangered birds or sandbars for camping, people will always pick endangered species, and that makes sense when you describe it that way. But to me, the loss of the big open sandbars of Grand Canyon is no less a loss than if someone were to propose to us, well, what if we just take 500 feet, a 500-foot slice out of the Coconino Sandstone? I mean, you've still got the canyon. It's going to be a little bit smaller, but hell, no one's going to notice if you just remove one of these layers. That's absurd. And I think that when you stand at a high point like the Nankoweap Overlook with Bob Rigg, and Bob Rigg looks downstream and says, I can't describe to you how much this place has changed. I can't share with you how different this place looks. When we stood up here in the 50s, there was nothing but sand along both banks of the river. Now I see gravel and tamarisk thickets, and it's a very different thing. And yes, those tamarisk groves are biologically productive, but we have lost this landscape looks very different than it used to, and it doesn't look different. The difference is something which is changeable. We can reinstitute those big open sandbars, and I think we need to. But the first thing we need to do is we need to pose that management dilemma before the public. I'm willing as a scientist to lay those two decisions before the public and in a good, solid argument pose what I believe, and then if I lose the argument, so be it. And my job, and then I will do whatever it takes, and I want to understand the system, but and if I lose the argument, so be it, because I always also recognize that there's a lot of compelling rationale to the argument that others have made to manage this river for biological productivity. But what I fear is that decision is not laid before the public. It is just taken as a given that there's only one way to manage this river. And I think it's high time that people stand up and articulate more clearly what are the objectives.
Okay, we better wrap.